The summer of 1875 hung heavy over Red Rock, Wyoming. The sun bore down like a hammer, pressing shadows sharp across the town square. Red Rock was a mining town that dressed itself in manners and scripture, but underneath it was nothing more than grit, whiskey, and debt. At the very center stood a tall wooden platform, not built for cattle sales or church sermons, but for judgment. A punishment carried out in public, with law twisted into spectacle. The townsfolk gathered in a restless swarm. Shopkeepers, miners blackened with soot, wives in pressed calico with lips thin as blades. They whispered, gossiped, waiting to see a woman who was not quite guilty, not quite innocent, but useful enough to blame. On the platform stood Clara Ward, wrists bound with frayed rope. Her dress was faded, wrinkled from nights on borrowed floors. At 25, she had been a widow for 5 years, childless, luckless, and now penniless. "This here is Clara Ward," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice booming across the crowd. "Debtor, nuisance, and a widow with nothing to her name. Sold by order of the court to pay what she owes this town." The crowd muttered. "She sued the mine after her husband died," one man scoffed. "Thought tears would buy her gold." "She's barren," hissed a woman, crossing her arms. 5 years and no baby. Cursed. Clara kept her eyes forward. Her husband had been crushed in shaft 3 when rotten beams collapsed. She had sold their home, pawned her ring, and begged loans from neighbors to hire a lawyer from Cheyenne. She had demanded justice. She had lost. And when she couldn't pay the debts, when even her dignity carried no price, she was dragged here to be sold. One body in place of coin. $5 to start, the auctioneer shouted. For a fine pair of hands, a sharp mind, and a mouth that knows the law better than most. Silence. Too frail, a voice jeered. She'll snap like kindling. Empty womb, another spat. Even her husband couldn't cede her. Clara's throat tightened, but she stood tall. Let them sneer. Let them rot in their scorn. I will not bend. Then hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, coming from the eastern road. The crowd shifted, murmuring as a lone rider appeared, followed by 6 children, some on small ponies, some walking in silence. They wore soft leather, earth-colored cloth. They were Comanche. The rider dismounted, broad-shouldered, weathered, carrying a stillness that silenced jeers. He tied his horse, stepped forward, and his children gathered behind him like shadows. "What's he want here?" a miner growled. "This is white man's law," another barked. The man said nothing. His gaze stayed fixed on Clara. Behind him, the youngest child, a girl of 5, peeked from behind her brother, eyes wide, small hand rising in a hesitant wave. The man stopped before the auctioneer. His voice was steady low. "I offer my horse," he said. "For her." The square erupted in laughter. The auctioneer's face twisted as the laughter rolled through the square. "Your horse," he barked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "This isn't some trading post, stranger. This is an auction by law." The Comanche man didn't flinch. His hand brushed the reins of the roan mare he'd ridden in on, her coat shining like burnished copper, her stance proud and unshaken even in the noise of the crowd. "She is worth more than coin," he said simply. The crowd snickered. "That mare could outrun half the cavalry," muttered a rancher. "He'd give it up for her?" The auctioneer sneered, raising his voice. "You heard the rules. Bidding starts at $5. A long silence followed. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody reached for a wallet. Clara stood frozen, heart pounding, as the jeers continued. She had prepared herself to be bought by a drunkard or a cruel ranch hand, to scrub floors until her back broke, maybe worse. But this man, his voice carried no mockery, no hunger, only certainty. "Fine," the auctioneer grumbled. "If no one else will put $1 down, then by authority of Red Rock, this debt is cleared." The woman goes with him. Gasps rose like dust from the square. Clara's knees weakened. She searched the man's face, trying to read him. Why her? Why here? But his expression gave nothing. Only calm, quiet resolve. The auctioneer yanked her rope loose, shoving it toward the stranger. "She's yours now, Comanche. May she be worth the horse you lost." The man didn't take the rope. Instead, He stepped closer and untied the knot himself, his fingers steady. The rope fell away, and Clara felt the blood rush back into her wrists. For the first time in months, no one held her. "Come," he said, his tone more invitation than command. His children mounted their ponies, the youngest girl still peeking curiously at Clara. The mare was left behind, reins tied to the post, payment for a life no one else wanted. Clara's feet moved before her mind did, following him down from the platform. Whispers chased her through the crowd. "Better a savage than a drunk. She'll be gone before winter. Cursed woman, he'll regret it." She kept walking. Dust clung to her hem, sweat stung her brow, but her spine stayed straight. She would not let them see fear. They passed the last saloon and the smell of sour whiskey, out toward the open land where the town's noise thinned to wind and cicadas. Only then did Clara speak, her voice low, dry as sand. "Why?" she asked. The man didn't turn. Because no one else did. Her heart twisted at the simplicity of it. They walked until the town shrank into nothing but a smear of smoke against the horizon. The Comanche man led with long, unhurried strides, his children following with a quiet discipline that unsettled Clara. They spoke little, only in low murmurs of a language she couldn't yet untangle. By dusk, they reached a clearing beside the river where several hides had been stretched to dry, and a small fire ring lay waiting to be lit. It wasn't a permanent home, more camp than house, but it carried a sense of order, of belonging, that Clara hadn't felt in years. The eldest boy gathered wood. The two younger girls carried water in clay jars. Even the little one helped, piling twigs into her brother's arms. Each child moved with the rhythm of a task well learned, as though no one ever had to tell them twice. Clara lingered at the edge, unsure of where to place herself. Her hands twitched with old habits. She wanted to fetch, to stir, to scrub, but she had no claim here. The man crouched near the fire pit, striking flint against steel. Sparks caught, flames curled. Finally, his gaze lifted to her. "You cook?" he asked. Clara blinked. "Yes, I do." He nodded once, not as command but as allowance, and slid a pot toward her. Her breath caught. It was the first task given to her not with scorn, not with pity, but with trust. She rolled up her sleeves, fingers finding steadiness in the rhythm of chopping and stirring. The smell of stew rose, mingling with smoke and wild sage carried by the wind. As the food simmered, she dared to glance at the children. The eldest, about 16, watched her with measured suspicion. The middle ones whispered among themselves, curiosity tucked behind guarded eyes. And the youngest, the little girl with wide, searching gaze, sat cross-legged at Clara's side, tugging gently at the hem of her skirt as if staking a quiet claim. When the stew was served, bowls were passed, silence broken only by the scrape of spoons. Clara tasted the broth, thin but warm. A meal shared. Afterward, the man spoke. His voice was calm, but carried weight. "My name is Tahi. These are my children. We work the land south of here. It is not much, but it is ours." Clara hesitated, then answered, "Clara Ward." He inclined his head, accepting it as enough. Night settled thick and star-heavy. A blanket was set out for her near the fire. The children curled together in hides. Tahi sat apart, sharpening a blade, gaze flickering between steel and flame. Clara lay awake, listening to the river, the quiet breathing of children, the rasp of stone against metal. Her life had been traded for a horse. She had been unwanted, discarded, bought without question. Yet here, wrapped in smoke and starlight, she felt something foreign, fragile. Not safety, not yet, but the faintest outline of belonging. The days that followed tested Clara more than the night she was auctioned off. Life with Tahi and his children was not the life she had known. There were no wooden floors to scrub, no chimneys to sweep. Instead, she rose with the dawn, her palms blistering from carrying water, her shoulders aching from chopping wood, her back sore from bending over hides to scrape them clean. The children worked beside her, never once complaining. They were swift, practiced, moving with a quiet purpose. Clara, though eager to prove herself, fumbled often. Pots tipped, Hide slipped from her grasp. More than once, she dropped a bundle of firewood only for the eldest boy to gather it without a word, his eyes cool and distant. Shame burned her cheeks. She had been sold as though she were useless. She would not remain so. At night, exhaustion pressed down like a weight, yet sleep came slow. The silence of the wild unnerved her, the howl of coyotes, the rustle of unseen things beyond the firelight. But what unsettled her most was Tahi's calm watchfulness. He spoke little, never raised his voice, never laid a hand in anger. And still, his quiet presence was heavier than chains. The little girl, though, seemed determined to anchor Clara. She followed her like a shadow, tugging her hand when she faltered, giggling at her clumsiness, curling against her side when the nights grew cold. Clara began to feel a knot in her chest loosen whenever the child's small fingers curled around hers. One evening, after a long day of hauling water, Clara paused at the riverbank, staring at her reflection trembling in the current. Dirt streaked her face, strands of hair clung to her cheeks, her hands were raw. She hardly recognized herself. Behind her, footsteps. "You are not weak," Tahi's voice said, steady as the river itself. Clara spun, startled. "I drop more than I carry. Your boy looks at me like I'm a burden." Tahi's gaze held hers. "He lost his mother. He does not trust easily. But he will see." Clara swallowed hard. "See what? That you do not give up." The words, simple as they were, rooted deep. For years, she had been told what she was not. Now, for the first time, someone spoke of what she could be. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead, Clara lay awake, her body aching yet her spirit kindled with something unfamiliar. A flicker of strength, a whisper of worth. By the fifth sunrise, Clara's hands no longer trembled when she lifted the water jars. The blisters on her palms had hardened into calluses, and though her body still ached each evening, she carried herself with a steadier rhythm. The children began to notice. The eldest boy, whom Tahi called Nakai, no longer rushed to gather what she dropped. Instead, he watched from the corner of his eye as she bent, lifted, and carried on without complaint. His silence was not yet approval, but it was no longer dismissal either. The two middle girls, quick with laughter, started whispering less and pointing less when she stumbled. One of them even pressed a strip of leather into Clara's hand to bind her hair out of her face while she worked. It was a small gesture, but it warmed her more than fire. And the youngest, the little one who clung to her, became Clara's constant companion. She trailed after her with a stick in hand, mimicking each of Clara's movements as though she were learning by play. At night, when the others drifted into slumber, she curled against Clara's side without hesitation, as though she had claimed her. Cooking became Clara's refuge. Around the fire, she stirred stews, baked simple breads, and tried her hand at herbs she had never tasted before. Each meal earned her not praise, but something better, quiet acceptance. Bowls emptied without complaint, spoons scraped clean, and no one turned away from what she made. One evening, as flames licked high, Tahi returned from the far ridge with fresh game slung across his shoulders. He laid it at Clara's feet, meeting her gaze. "You know what to do," he said. It was not a command. It was trust. Clara's throat tightened. She cleaned and cooked the meat, her movements careful, her hands sure. When the food was shared, she noticed Nakai take the first bite without hesitation. A silence followed, brief but heavy. Then, he nodded once and kept eating. Clara's chest swelled. It was not praise spoken aloud. It was better than words. Later that night, after the fire dimmed to embers, Clara sat with the youngest girl asleep in her lap. The air was cool, the sky thick with stars. Tahi sat sharpening his blade, as he often did, his face unreadable in the flicker of firelight. Clara whispered, almost to herself, "I was nothing, not long ago." Tahi's hand stilled on the blade. His eyes lifted. "You are not nothing," he said. "Not here." The words sank deep, steady and solid as stone. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to believe them. The peace Clara had begun to taste did not last long. One afternoon, while the children gathered berries near the ridge and Clara bent to fill a water jug, a sound broke the stillness. Hoofbeats. slow at first, then louder, pressing into the earth like thunder. Her breath caught. She had heard those boots before, had seen those kinds of riders. Men who smiled like wolves. Tahi appeared from the tree line, moving with quiet urgency. His hand went to the knife at his belt, his eyes cutting toward Clara. "Keep the children close," he said. 3 riders crested the hill. Dust rose behind them, their rifles gleaming in the sun. Their horses were lean, restless, as though sensing the violence their riders carried. "Afternoon," one of the men called, a crooked grin plastered across his face. "Didn't know anyone was living out here." Tahi did not answer. He stood tall, silent, his children gathering behind him like shadows. Clara pulled the smallest girl against her, heart pounding in her throat. The rider's eyes shifted. They landed on Clara. A smirk twisted one man's mouth. "Well now," he drawled. "That's a surprise. Thought we'd find only skins and bones, but seems you've got yourself a prize." Heat rushed into Clara's cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the earth. Instead, she straightened her back, forcing her breath steady. Tahi's voice was calm, cold. "She is not yours to speak of." The smirk faded, replaced with something sharper, hungrier. "Careful, friend. The world don't give men like you much claim over anything. Maybe we'll just take what we want." The words hung heavy, the air tightening. One of the riders rested his hand on the stock of his rifle. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. For a moment, she saw her life folding back into the same nightmare. Men with power, her voice swallowed by fear. But before the riders could make their move, Nakai stepped forward. The boy, quiet and watchful until now, placed himself between Clara and the strangers, his small frame rigid as iron. His hand clutched the handle of a hatchet, knuckles white. The sight pierced Clara, not because he was ready to fight, but because he believed she was worth protecting. The riders laughed, mocking the boy's defiance. But Clara saw Tahi shift, his stance like a bowstring drawn tight. If steel was loosed, it would be quick, merciless. For a breath, time held. Then, as though measuring the odds, the riders pulled their reins. Not worth the trouble, the leaders spat, and with a tug, they turned, hooves kicking up a cloud of dust as they rode off into the horizon. Only when the sound faded did Clara realize she had been holding her breath. She looked at Nakai, still standing guard before her, and at Tahi, whose steady gaze met hers across the firelit clearing. In that silence, something changed. She was no longer an outsider surviving among them. She belonged to their circle now, bound not by chains, but by choice. After the riders vanished into the horizon, life at the camp shifted in a way Clara could not ignore. Nakai still carried the weight of his defiance, walking taller, though his voice remained few and guarded. The younger girls clung to Clara even more, as though the moment of danger had sealed her to them. And Tahi, though he spoke little of what had happened, watched her with a gaze that carried something unspoken, something steady. Each day, Clara found herself working side by side with him. They cut wood together, hauled water from the stream, and mended what needed mending. Their movements were not in rhythm at first, but gradually, like 2 instruments learning the same song, they began to fall in step. One evening, when the heat of the sun gave way to the cool breath of dusk, Clara knelt by the fire, tending stew. Tahi returned with fresh herbs in hand. Without a word, he knelt beside her and placed them in the pot. Their hands brushed. It was the smallest of touches, yet Clara felt it burn hotter than the flames. She dared a glance at him. His face was calm, unreadable, but in his eyes she caught it, a flicker, brief and undeniable. The children's laughter rang out nearby, the little one chasing fireflies while the others teased her. For a moment, Clara imagined herself woven fully into this life, not as a guest or a stranger, but as part of its fabric. Later that night, when the others drifted into slumber, Clara sat awake by the dying fire. Tahi remained across from her, sharpening his blade as always. "You didn't have to stand for me," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the wind. Against those men. Tahi lifted his eyes. The firelight danced across his features, casting shadows that made him look carved from stone. "You are under my protection," he said simply. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to argue, to say she was no burden, no fragile thing to be guarded. But when she opened her mouth, what came out instead was softer. "And if I wanted to protect you too?" The blade stilled in his hands. His gaze lingered on hers longer than it ever had before. Then, with a slow nod, he answered, "Then we stand for each other." The words rooted deep inside her, steady and sure. For the first time in her life, Clara did not feel like a shadow clinging to someone else's fire. She felt like she was part of the flame itself. Seasons shifted quietly, as they always do. The wind carried cooler nights, and the hills dressed themselves in the faded colors of autumn. With every passing day, Clara felt less like a woman wandering between worlds and more like a thread firmly tied into this one. She worked as if she had always been there, teaching the younger girl songs her mother once hummed, stitching together garments from scraps of cloth, and even showing Nakai how to write letters in the dirt. At first he only frowned, but then, slowly, he began to carve shapes of his own. Tahi watched it all from his quiet distance, though Clara often caught the faintest curve of pride tugging at the edge of his mouth. One evening, the sky bled into shades of violet and gold, and Clara stood by the fire, stirring the stew. The children crowded close, their chatter filling the air. Tahi returned from the ridge with games slung over his shoulder. For the first time, Clara did not step aside. She took the weight from him, steady in her hands, and he let her. That night, after the meal was done and the little ones drifted into dreams, Clara sat outside, gazing at the stars. The air was sharp, the kind that carried the promise of winter. Tahi joined her, lowering himself to the ground without a word. For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the night. Then Clara spoke, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the embers. "I came here lost," she said. "I thought I would never belong anywhere again." Tahi turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "And now?" She met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "Now I belong to something greater than myself." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing the truth of her words. Then he reached out, not sudden, not fierce, but with a quiet strength, and took her hand. No vows were spoken. No grand declarations filled the night. But in that simple gesture, Clara understood. She was not a guest in his world anymore. She was home. The fire dimmed, the stars burned brighter, and together, they sat in the stillness of a life that was no longer broken, but whole.